Hello, beautiful community. We're going to have a long-form chat that is really a sideways glance at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and at some of the horrors we've seen in the last day or two. And we're going to do that not with a view to explaining what we've just witnessed or explaining the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but with a view to giving you some ethical resources to think about conflicts in the future and to think about conflicts and the deployment of violence by state and not state forces, in years to come. So if you're one of the younger viewers, you're actually still in a tiny minority. The single biggest demographic on this channel is the over 65s, and it's even truer on the main channel. But of course, age doesn't matter. But if you're of the younger generation, this is going to be an educational, evergreen conversation about how you begin processing conflicts and the ethics of the use of force and the ethics of taking human lives. And we're going to do about 5 to 10 things in this talk, but as ever, it's important to keep things simple. So there is going to be one thing that is more important than any of the others, and that's the main thing that you're going to take away from this video. I'll say a little bit what it is at the beginning, and then we'll get to it again at the end of our chat. Now, I've been away for a day or two for health reasons, and I'm able to speak with you now for about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, I think. But as grateful as I feel to be able to connect with you, I'm not entirely on top form. So this may be a bit more dragged out and repetitive and slow than necessary. I apologize for that. And of course, this is always a risky enterprise to not be feeling like you're clearly able to speak well when you're talking about such an intensely hot topic about which probably 20% of you aren't even capable of having an entirely rational conversation at the moment. So I'll clearly suggest some very strong views about different aspects of what we're seeing, but fundamentally it's not about what views you have. It's about some general principles that are going to be evergreen. Let's go. An aside, and I've spent about 15 minutes just writing a few headlines about what I want to hit, and I have no idea of how well I'll be able to hit it in this chat with you, so we'll just try, and you're gonna, if you have the energy to invest, you're gonna, give this a shot too of staying with me. So let's do it. First thing I wanted to say, mistrust, and I'm speaking in a tongue-in-cheek way because you should never blankly mistrust anybody on the basis of an abstract principle, but mistrust anyone who thinks that they can state their view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2 minutes flat or in 5 minutes flat. So yes, by all means, watch explainers, listen to explainers, read explainers if you don't have a deep immersion in this story, as a lot of people do. My own, in part, starts from the fact that in my childhood, just before my teenage period, and maybe a bit into my teenage period, I lived for 4 years in Israel. In fact, when I came to England in 1994, my first language, my preferred language was Hebrew. So I spoke Hebrew for the first couple of years of my time in England when I could. And it's a language I've forgotten since then. Israeli friends accuse me of having forgotten it for political reasons, but nothing of the kind. I just didn't practice it at all. So it's unavailable to me now. Having said that, that by no means makes me have disproportionate sympathies to Israel across the history we've seen in recent decades. So I'm confident about that, but I'm sharing this biographical detail with you. So there are no 2 to 5 minute introductions to this, okay? And if you can state this, then in 2 minutes, then you're not really being entirely serious. And my great philosophical colleague Alistair McIntyre has this principle that he doesn't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unless he only talks about it. Because in philosophy, you talk about politics. Often at the end of a lecture, somebody puts up their hand and says, what about this? And, okay. But we're going to risk contradicting ourselves with this and put a few principles down briefly. That's not going to be the main point of the video about how to begin thinking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what am I holding you here for? It's a main principle that I'm very passionate about, and that it's going to be absolutely central if you find this talk helpful or persuasive to how you think about conflict for the rest of your time in life. And it's that there is something very important that's quite simple. But just because it's simple, it doesn't mean we understand it as well as we should, or think about it as well as we should. But it's this. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants is hugely important in war, in strife, in conflict. Ethically, that distinction is hugely important. And the way in which it's hugely important is this. The pressures, the ethical pressures of protecting the lives of non-combatants do not dramatically change depending on the justice of the war that you're prosecuting. It's quite beyond words the kind of slum that certain social media platforms have been over the last 24 plus hours. And one of the two things that have been dreadfully run together is the question of the justness of starting a war, right? And the justice of how you prosecute the war. And what I'm giving with my principle here is a very important understanding that the justice of how you prosecute a war, right, our understanding of what's a just way of prosecuting a war, should change less than it does in practice, depending on how justified we think our war is. There is a tendency to bridge the two. And I'm speaking against that. I'm saying, yes, of course, right? How you prosecute the war and what you think is an ethically adequate way of prosecuting a war is going to be dependent on how just you think your war is. And that's inevitable. But we shouldn't let the shape of our thinking about what it means to prosecute a war justly change too much, depending on what visions, ideas, ideological pictures we have of why the war is justified in the first place. So, as I've made a note here, how we make the distinction between combatants and non-combatants should not change too much, so we're being realists, too much, depending on the justice of the war or struggle you're engaged in. Okay? So, that leads to another way of putting the same thought that's very helpful. It matters. It's inevitably going to matter. And therefore, to some extent, you can say it should matter what the citizenship, the ethnicity, the group belonging is of non-combatants who you might be targeting. It's going to matter. But it shouldn't matter dramatically and out of all proportion. So what does that mean? It means that if the United States, just to take a random example, the biggest military power in the world, is engaging in a military operation that, let us say, we can justify, and let's not get into any actual history for the moment. But if the United States is doing a military intervention that we can justify, right, in a distant part of the world relative to the US should think of citizens that might be killed as collateral damage in a way that is not radically different to how it would think of them if they were US citizens. And of course, it can't think of them like they were US citizens. It's just not going to fly, right? Because the whole basis of democratic legitimacy is contained within states. Of course, you're going to prioritize your citizens. There's no question about that. But if you're conducting yourself in a way in which, and this is going to be horrifically crude, but if you're conducting yourself in a way in which the lives of the non-combatants, right, in some place you're bombing, let's say you're justified in bombing it, right? But if you relate to these non-combatants in that place as though their individual lives were 1,000 times less important than the lives of US citizens, right, then something has gone very wrong. But at the same time, no, of course it means that we can't, it doesn't mean that we have to expect the United States to treat all non-combatants ethically as though they were US citizens. But what it means is that you should not drift too far from that way of looking at it, right? One of the evils of terrorism is that it constitutively tries to blend this distinction. I will say more about that later. It constitutively tries to break that distinction between combatants and non-combatants that I'm trying to make a little bit sacred in this conversation. So, the justice of the decision to go to war and the justice of the conduct of the war, right, are two things that we're trying to keep apart with this big emphasis on combatants and non-combatants. Okay. Let's say very briefly just a little bit about Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then we'll proceed more with these transferable evergreen ethical, political ethical reflections. Now, it's obvious that Israel is a democracy inside the Green Line that is having a democratic wobble at the moment, and quite a precarious democratic wobble. It's got an anti-democratic authoritarian project trying to break the central counter-majoritarian institution that controls that checks the power of the government. And that means that Israeli democracy is in danger, but it doesn't stop Israel from being a democracy. But Israel is a democracy, and it isn't, because it is engaged in a very bizarre kind of colonial rule with many elements of apartheid. And that's what's strange about it. I think that's strange about it is the contiguous nature of it, that normally we have a colonizer here and this colony over there, but in Israel the two are connected. And there are indeed overlaps here I won't pursue about how that sits psychologically with Israelis and actually some of the challenges Russians have realizing what their government's up to. A remarkable capacity for an absence of empathy about what one's state is doing just tens of tens of miles from where one is. Now, how do you begin to frame your own views, not my views, your own views about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, here is a suggestion of about 5 steps. Does Israel have a right to exist? And my answers are not going to be important in the conversation that we have. Does Israel have a right to exist? It happens that I strongly recommend that the answer is yes. Does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? Well, if you mean by that Israel can exist as a sort of civic pluralistic entity with its official religion being Judaism, the answer to that, again, unimportant, but I'd recommend is yes. But if Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state means a very specific kind of ideological project, right? That goes with certain religious and political conceptions, that has certain implications, not just for Palestinians, but for Israeli Arabs, folks who are living inside Israel. That is not something that I would recommend Palestinians need to accept remotely. So insofar as Israel is a Jewish state in this more specially ideological sense, then I'd recommend that doesn't need to be accepted. But that's a question for you. The third element here is really an understanding of the subjugation of the Palestinian people and the injustices generated by Israel over many years, and an understanding of that does not underestimate the situation, right? And then there are solutions, and this is really difficult, but what we're talking about is a solution that's adequate to Israelis, but also a solution that's got to be adequate to the Palestinians. A fifth question that's particularly relevant in the last couple of days, that goes back to this distinction we've just made, is violent resistance justified for Palestinians, right? And here we go back to the justice of the decision to go to war and the justice of the conduct of war, right? So if you were to answer that question as yes about the Palestinian right of violent resistance, nothing follows from that about engaging in evil, engaging in atrocities, engaging in the most despicable form of terrorism. Obviously, a lot of people have struggled to understand that. Let's say a little bit more before we get down to the deeper points about the social media mess that you've been exposed to in the last few days. Now, the problem with us is that we struggle to keep two things in mind at the same time, particularly when we're on social media. And so we'll get to whataboutism, by the way, in a second. But understanding the Hamas atrocities and keeping in mind the history of Israeli oppression and injustices, right, been two things that people have struggled in various ways to keep in mind at the same time. And they've also failed to understand, in the way we'll discuss shortly, how sometimes when terrible things happen, you just need to focus on those for a while, right? Let me say something hypothetical that is a question for you. Right? It's gonna be helpful for you to think about in your own time. An oppressor can play a part in constructing a situation in which you've got an oppressed group with few options for constructive action, right? So that group might be in a situation partly through the actions of the oppressor. To what extent? Right? It might be in a situation where it has no real options for ethically acceptable, legitimate, or effective action. Right? So that's a very important question to ask about various situations in the world. How far is this true? And we'll make some interesting observations about counterfactual accounts of what might have happened with Ukraine if it got no Western support later. Whataboutism. Now, how do you handle it? Because when you have a situation when a baby is killed in front of its siblings and parents, when a political entity is creating a bloodbath of transparently non-competence, and that bloodbath is what you're witnessing, how should you react to it? Because on the one hand, it feels wrong to say, what a horrendous bloodbath, but let's look at the history of how this came about. On the other hand, it feels obvious that we've got to say this. So what comes in here, and this is where a lot of people have not conducted themselves in an appropriately adult way on social media and have therefore been understandably misunderstood, right? There's a lot of people who fail to understand what it means to have a plural economy of discourse, not just out there in society, but inside you. And that means that you say something on a Monday or a Saturday, but then say something different or put it a different way on a Tuesday. So let's say that I've done something to betray you, right? Speaking about personal life, because I screwed something up because of my own inadequacy or incapacity or whatever. And let's say it's turned out really badly, so I need to really own it. Well, on the Monday, I might just own it by feeling like I have nothing adequate to say because I don't want to make excuses. And I want to just appreciate that I've screwed up so badly it is kind of beyond words. And I just want to be there for you without explaining myself, right? You might need that because explanations will sound like excuses. But then on another day, you may need for me to sit there for 4 hours and explain to you how on earth I managed to screw that up so badly. So it's both, right? And often professional moral philosophers get this wrong. They think that there's got to be a right way to respond and it's the same way Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. No, it's not, right? And so I wasn't tweeting, and I regularly go without tweeting that often, but I am on Twitter. But if I were regularly tweeting about this, then what I would make sure I do is, first of all, acknowledge the atrocities of Hamas, period, without having a sentence below. But we have to understand the concept and Israel's role in bringing about this ghastly situation which generated these people and these people doing these things and blah, blah, blah. And then I could say a second time that I just acknowledge what happened. And then a third time when I acknowledge what happened, I could then say, and also this context of how we got here. And a fourth time, I could just say, and also this, without acknowledging what happened, right? And so a lot of people got in trouble and got terribly misunderstood by doing as the first thing they did, the move, oh my word, yeah, the bloodbath by Hamas is horrific, but what about Israel? But what about Israel doing this and that and that and that and this and this and this and this? And the point isn't that you can't do that. The point is that there are times when you can when you should be able to understand that just that first thing is for the moment appropriate, for the moment enough, and you don't need to move to the and also or and but until the next tweet or until 2 hours later, for goodness sake. So a lot of people have really, really struggled with that. And that is also a special way in which our culture and our discourse are struggling with, if you like, enticements into adulthood. But the answer basically is that, you condemn on a Monday, on a Tuesday you condemn, and then you can tell the story and the explanation that you have, the answers that you choose to some of the questions we raised earlier, and so on. One of the worst takes in the world on this is the hyper-identity politics Western decolonization take of the pro-Palestinian kind. I shouldn't say pro-Palestinian because it implies Hamas is pro-Palestinian, and Hamas is a curse, and a curse upon the Palestinian people too. And what we're going to have is a situation where the bloodbath we saw is going to create an absolute nightmare for the Palestinian people, right? It's going to be a product of the Israeli response. So let me then just acknowledge my wobbliness and casualness there with language, but go back to saying that the hyper-identity politics view, which said, this is what decolonization looks like, it's not always pretty. You saw a lot of that. And so I didn't even pick up any of these tweets because they were so absurd and depoliticized and actually racist. Well, that's the way you do decolonization. If that's the way you think a group, that's the only way you think a group can do decolonization, then your views about that group must not be adequate. You must have some real prejudice about that group. Now, so this has been a bunch of people who have accepted or even celebrated the atrocity while sort of sitting in Portland and saying, well, yes, this is just decolonization, and it has a kind of a family resemblance with the decolonization I am doing. Well, what decolonization are you doing? Oh, I am decolonizing my workplace, my local community, and my syllabus. And of course, sure, okay. To an extent, that's reasonable. I do think that syllabuses need to be decolonized. Now, that shouldn't become ideology, and it is becoming that most of the time, but absolutely we need to decolonize syllabuses. So I'm not mocking the whole story, not at all, but I'm saying it takes a constructive or a destructive shape, right? And so what was particularly awful about these takes is that we've seen a lot of Israelis killed. And we're going to be seeing a lot of Palestinians being killed. And that's what you're celebrating as your little fake idea of decolonization? Right? No more words. No more words are necessary. Let's say a little bit about fundamentalist violence before going on. Now, I don't want to say that what Hamas did is entirely depoliticized. There are plenty political enterprises in their actions. One glaring one is the taking of hostages that they will try to use to exchange, also as human shields, and also to elevate themselves into a kind of preeminent position as a Palestinian organization, having to an extent supposedly brought Israel to its knees and having achieved these transformations. of exchanging people that they want back. But there's a lot of not just depoliticization, but fundamentalism in the actions. Depoliticization just means that the actions are not connected with a constructive account of agency, right? So it's not just that these are dreadful atrocities, but how are they going to benefit the Palestinian people? Well, they're going to make things much, much worse for the Palestinian people. So any conceivable account of agency here is going to demonstrate that this makes life worse for Palestinian people. Now, let's say something about fundamentalist violence. I won't analyze in detail how this plays a part in this, but I'll just make this point abstractly. A very important part of fundamentalist violence is a before and after distinction. And it's a distinction that we're all tempted into, but fundamentalist violence teaches us about the mechanics of that distinction. And that distinction says, I can maintain a kind of purity even though I cause a bloodbath, because once an appropriate kind of future comes about and the leaf of history is turned, if there is going to be a leaf that's turned in this world at all, then we can start afresh, and the bloodbaths that have helped us get to that new leaf will no longer count when the leaf is turned. So it's almost if I want you to be my best friend, but you can't because Ricky is your best friend instead, and I eat Ricky for breakfast, and think that that could then create a turning of a page whereby you and I become best friends. And the special nature of this before and after illusion is that it forgets the fact that you're going to be a person with an eaten friend Ricky. And being a person with an eaten friend Ricky is not going to make you enthusiastic about being best friends with the eater of your friend Ricky. We're not going to eat Ricky, don't worry. That is something that manifests, though, in a lighter way in all of our political activities, too. Look at the depolarization in Western democracies and how it makes us treat our political opponents as though they were enemies, on the assumption that when we deal with our political opponents, because they've got out of hand, once we deal with them, we're not going to need to behave in that way again. And all sides think that, actually, right? Look at the other day, what Hillary Clinton said, that Trump voters need a program of re-education, which is not as bad as the deplorable statement she made, but it's a horrendous political statement that actually Bill would never make. Not endorsing or criticizing Bill Clinton here, I'm not going there. Now, what that means in terms of this before and after distinction that Hillary is engaging in, right? She's engaging in it, of course, just in virtue of doing a TV interview, not in virtue of, in that moment, killing anybody, but it's a very tiny version of the same mechanism, though, because the thought is that, well, we can treat our fellow citizens as though they were deliberative delinquents now because we're in a crisis, but once we sort the crisis out, we will reach a situation where citizens do not need to speak of each other as deplorables or deliberative inadequates and so on. Right? When people storm institutions of democracy, January 6th, their thinking isn't, oh yeah, that's a good thing to do. Their thinking is, once we sort the country out and bring the country back, various species of magical thinking, then we won't need to do this. Right? when, and I'm not making straight comparisons here, but when certain Brexit voters, a very small number of people, said very unsavory things about British members of parliament who were in favor of Remain. And sometimes you had stories of threats and even worse than threats. It was clear that the logic there was, we've got to do this now, but once we get our country back, once we have the kind of Brexit we want, then we wouldn't need to threaten members of parliament. And the other way around, in a less repulsive but also nevertheless still quite toxic way, what are called Remoaners in Britain. It's an unlovely name because it's part of a culture war, so let me not use it, in fact, because I'm myself a very strong Remainer, a deeply strong Remainer, but I have lost, so I acknowledge that I have irreversibly lost that battle, really. I wish it wasn't so, but I've lost, and I take responsibility for that. But a lot of people feel something went wrong, and it's an outbreak of irrationality by voters that needs to be fixed. Well, I don't feel like that. I just feel I've lost in a way that I really do not like, but I lost. But certain teleological Remainers have just gone on saying, well, we have a bunch of completely irrational voters, they need to be fixed. And no, you shouldn't go around fixing voters, but we have a crisis of this deep outbreak of primordial primitive instincts among our voters, and once we fix those, we can go back and be respectful to each other. The principle, finally, oh my word, 37 minutes in. Now, I'm not going to restate the principle here, so I hope that we remember what I said right at the beginning, but I'm just going to add a little bit to it. Consider three positions. Trying to kill civilians, which is what we saw Hamas doing. Position 1. Position 2. Not trying to kill civilians. Position 3. Trying not to kill civilians. And one of the big crises of how a lot of big agents, big political agents, big countries in the world act is that they don't try to kill civilians, right? But instead of trying not to kill civilians, they just are clearly in the business of not trying to kill civilians. And that's what we're going to see in the Israeli response, right? There's going to be a very concerning absence, insufficiency of the ethical aspiration of trying to not kill civilians. And normally when we talk about conflicts, this expression collateral damage obscures our thought here and makes us feel that there are two things we should distinguish here. Are you trying to kill civilians or you're not? Whereas instead it should be three. Are you trying to kill civilians? Okay, you're not, but are you just not trying to kill civilians, or are you trying to not kill civilians, right? That is an absolutely central distinction that is ethically lost in how we talk and in how powers justify their conduct. So, of course, let's make some more somewhat abstract points, but they go to the heart of how we deal with the prosecution of war, military violence, and so on. Political violence. Now, obviously, killing civilians intentionally is really bad. Not avoiding the killing of civilians as a byproduct of other violence you're engaged in, no matter how just or unjust it is bad. And here we begin to enter a situation where numbers matter. So imagine one political entity has intentionally killed 10 people. Abstractly. And these things are not well discussed in the abstract, but discussing them with the full flesh of detail requires just a conversation takes 5 hours. And then imagine another political entity that's killed 10 people, but in a different way. It's not tried to kill them, it's just not taken much care not to kill them while trying to kill people that we can agree it has a right to try to kill. Now, obviously, we're going to say that the position A, where people were deliberately killed, is worse. But what if we change the numbers here? What if one political entity has deliberately killed one person and another political entity has gone about, let us say, an enterprise where it's killing some people it has a right to kill, but as a byproduct of that, it has done nothing to minimize danger to non-combatants, let's say, around. And as a result of making such minimal efforts in that direction, it's killed 100 people. Right? Here, it's no longer obvious where to go. And that's very important to understand. And this takes us to a special ethical conversation that applies across wars. And that's what were called free fire zones during the US war in Vietnam. And there was some debate and some misrepresentation of what the Israeli authoritarian Netanyahu said about people in Gaza needing to move. Was he saying they need to move from there, which of course doesn't make sense because they're stuck? Or was he saying they just need to move from one bit to another in accordance with where Israel said that what Israel said they're going to bomb? And there's a very important ethical distinction here, and I want to put it on the table. When countries or political entities say, please get out, we're going to orchestrate violence in these spots where you live, let's say, right? The reality on the ground is that people are going to be old. People are going to be sick. People are going to have relatives who are old and sick. People will have nowhere to go. People will just not leave because they don't want to leave because they don't want to leave. People will feel that if they leave, they'll lose their home or they'll have their home robbed. It's one of the stories we haven't talked about in the Ukrainian context, right? How people with illness, people with chronic illness, people who are very elderly have been impacted by the evil of the Putin regime. Now, what does that mean ethically? It means that the ethical emphasis is not on telling people to move, but on understanding how many people have actually moved, or at the very least having a very good realistic understanding of how many people will be moving, and on the basis of what you think the answer to that is, deciding the action you're going to take. Deciding whether you will take the action and deciding what kind of action you will take. And it's also, of course, the case that in many types of conflict, figuring that out itself may endanger your own forces or your own competence and so on. Some of what I'm beginning to say is reminiscent of a letter that the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit and the wonderful philosopher Michael Walzer wrote in the New York Review of Books about 10-15 years ago about similar issues, where they said, Israel making phone calls and dropping leaflets and making announcement is not enough. That's not where the ethical emphasis needs to be. The ethical emphasis needs to be on realistically how many people are going to be there, not on whether you've done something to spread the information, right? Especially in a context where all these universals will apply, that some people just struggle to leave, but also, where they got to go in Gaza, there are no shelters and so on. So that's a very important principle. One of the arguments that's often made in these waters is an argument about effective control, and the Israeli state often makes this argument historically, and it goes like this. And I think that is also covered in that letter that Walter and Margalit wrote. What are we gonna do if we have a mixed population somewhere where we feel we've got attack of combatants and non-combatants on a territory over which we don't have effective control? And let's add the detail that often in many conflicts, organizations that we might classify to a greater or less extent as terrorist organizations will artificially create this mixture of combatants and non-combatants, right? And that's a common recurring pattern. What are we going to do if we don't control these territories? Well, I think from what I remember in that letter, Margalit and Walzer responded to their interlocutors by saying, well, if you controlled that territory completely, you wouldn't need to attack it in the first place. You just need to reduce casualties. These are choices that Hamas has too. So when the gates broke, right, Hamas had a choice about what they were going to do. And their choice was to engage in violence that fully obliterated the combatant-non-combatant distinction in a way that's driven by an outlook about group identity and ethnic identity that is hugely reminiscent of the worst crimes we've seen on this continent, on the European continent, in the 20th century. One of the political dimensions of this ethical distinction that we're putting on the table about combatants and non-combatants, and the distance between the question of whether it's a just conflict and how you prosecute it. One of the things that comes out of this is that you want, if you are in a given conflict on the right side or way closer to being on the right side than the other side is, right? What you want to do is make things look like they're the bad guys and you're not. And one of the best ways to do that is to draw a sharper distinction between combatants and non-combatants than they do by a very long distance. Or at least, if they're horrendous at that distinction, if they specifically obliterate that distinction, you should go the other way and try to keep it quite distinct so that half of the world doesn't think that, well, that other side is bad, but you're bad too. So there's a real pictorial politics here that's very powerful. And actually, if Putin were smart, he would have used that kind of story in Ukraine. And he is smart, but he's just delusional. So if Putin were undelusional is the better thing to say here. Now Ukraine. What's the analogy that we can make that's illuminating? Well, it's that Ukraine, on balance, has been really pretty good at keeping the combatant, non-combatant distinction. Now, my prediction is that as the war moves more onto Russian soil in 2024, that distinction will blur a little bit more, and we should already be considering the serious possibility of a mass civilian casualty event in Russia, and what the consequences of that, if any, might be. But imagine this situation. Imagine nobody was with Ukraine. Imagine Ukraine were completely alone and no sanctions were put on Russia. Russia without sanctions and Ukraine completely alone, kind of a nightmarish world, would mean Ukraine would be taken over eventually by the Russians. The Russians could never exercise ideological control over Ukraine because it's too late. You can't put it back in the bottle. You can't bring the world back to prior to 2014. The anti-colonial identity in Ukraine is too strong, and they would have deeply felt that they need to tell the Russians where to go if the Russians physically, militarily took them over. But in that kind of situation, of course you would see a dramatic blurring of the distinction between combatants and not combatants in the way Ukraine conducted itself. And Ukraine would absolutely orchestrate attacks on Russian territory including aimed at civilians. Right? Not all Ukrainians would support that, but that would happen. And there's a smaller point to make in this direction, and that's that promising Ukraine EU membership, or NATO membership for that matter, keeping these doors open makes it easier for Ukraine to keep on respecting quite well the combatant, non-combatant distinction, actually, in the way they engage in the war. So that's the aside I wanted to make. Some global policy implications very, very quickly. I think for Israel, the one policy implication that we saw is that you can't manage the conflict without trying to solve it. It's gonna explode in your face. And I won't get into the details of that because we've gone on for so long. The self-elevation of Hamas by Hamas concept is something I'll probably also won't talk about. The relative weakness of US diplomacy here. And here's a quote from Blinken on Twitter. I spoke with the Palestinian Authority President Abbas to discuss the terrorist attacks against Israel. I urge that all leaders in the region must condemn these appalling acts of terrorism. And now Abbas doesn't have much legitimacy or power. And, in a certain sense, as one lovely British journalist tweeted, that's a kind of indication of the story that we're going to have Egypt and Turkey and Qatar and other agents involved here with insufficient diplomatic grip for the United States. Question on top of this principle that we've discussed is, do you want to understand the historical and philosophical features of nationalist violence better? A colleague of mine did a tweet about the work of Charles Taylor on this. And that colleague is Jason Blakely. Very nice. Philosopher of the younger generation. He has recommended the fact that Charles Taylor, recommended books of Charles Taylor, who's written on this so beautifully. And I'm going to link to a tweet, a Twitter thread by Jason. I'm just fidgeting through my Taylor books, of books by Taylor that are relevant to this, but I'll briefly show them here. This is perhaps the most accessible, The Ethics of Authenticity. This collection, Dilemmas and Connections, has an essay on fundamentalist violence that briefly discusses this before-after distinction that I put on the table for us. Taylor's written two massive books, one in the 80s and one in this century, that are also important to this conversation. This is A Secular Age from 2004. And will this do for now? Politics of Recognition is something else. That's enough. So you are, I mean, speaking of political virtues, courage in the non-political sense is something you've required to just force yourself to sit through this. This has been affected by my health challenge quite a bit, this conversation, because I've really had to work hard with my brain to keep the language coming out. But the reality is I'm committed to keeping this conversation growing, to keeping it going. And so I just wanted to connect with you like this. Lots of love. I hope this was of some value. Talk soon.